She was just an elderly woman, walking slowly down the street with her shopping bag, unaware that danger was closing in. To the scammers, she looked like the perfect target, frail, alone, and vulnerable. They whispered promises of easy riches, spun lies of urgency and fear, all designed to strip her of what little she had left. But what they did not expect was that the community around her would not stay silent. What seemed like an ordinary afternoon would soon turn into a powerful story of unity, courage, and justice. The first person to notice was a young shopkeeper. He had seen too many similar tricks before: the fake smiles, the forced politeness, the way scammers preyed on trust. His chest tightened as he watched the scene unfold. Without hesitation, he stepped outside, his presence firm, his voice clear. And in that small but decisive act, others began to turn their heads, realizing something was wrong. Within moments, neighbors, workers, and passers-by gathered. At first, it was only curiosity. But then, as they saw the fear growing in the elderly woman's eyes, curiosity became outrage. These were not strangers anymore. They were protectors, bound by the unspoken truth that no one should suffer alone. One by one, they stepped closer, surrounding her not with walls, but with hearts unwilling to bend to cruelty. The scammers, caught off guard, tried to maintain their act. They raised their voices, waving papers and insisting it was official business. But their lies had already lost their power. Every word they spoke was drowned out by the steady, unwavering presence of the crowd. The elderly woman, once trembling, began to feel the shift. Her shoulders straightened slightly, her breathing slowed, and for the first time that day, she knew she was safe. This was not just a rescue. It was a declaration that compassion is stronger than deceit, that a community willing to stand together can break the chains of fear. And what happened on that street would soon remind everyone who heard it. Justice does not always come from courts or uniforms. Sometimes, it rises from ordinary people choosing to act at the right moment, turning strangers into guardians and vulnerability into strength. The elderly woman's hands shook as she tried to understand the papers shoved before her. Numbers, false contracts, and urgent threats filled the page, designed to confuse, designed to scare. Her heart raced, and she could feel the weight of helplessness pressing down. To the scammers, she was just another easy victim. But to the eyes watching from across the street, she was a neighbor, a grandmother, a soul worth protecting. That realization was the spark that set everything into motion. The young shopkeeper, who had first stepped out, raised his voice louder this time. His words carried not just defiance, but clarity. "You will not take advantage of her here." The tone cut through the scammers' deception like a blade. Their fake smiles faltered, and their grip on control began to slip. For the woman, that moment of interruption was like air rushing back into her lungs. A teenager riding past on his bike stopped, watching the scene unfold. His first instinct was to stay quiet, but something inside him told him to act. He parked his bike, stood tall, and placed himself beside the shopkeeper. It was a small gesture, but it carried great power, because the sight of two people standing up emboldened others. Soon, 3 more neighbors crossed the street. One by one, they formed a circle that was growing stronger by the second. The scammers tried to raise their voices, shouting about legal documents and government authority, but no one believed them anymore. The crowd's presence turned their words into empty noise. What once looked like intimidation now looked like desperation. Every step the community took closer was a step away from fear, and the elderly woman could feel her strength returning as she saw the line of protectors forming before her. By the time 10 people stood together, the air had already changed. It was no longer a battle between one woman and her predators. It had become a stand between right and wrong, between deception and unity. And in that moment, the elderly woman understood. She was no longer fighting this battle alone. The scammers exchanged nervous glances, realizing their plan was unraveling. The elderly woman was no longer isolated, and the crowd's determination was like an unspoken verdict against them. Still, they pressed forward, thinking bluster might break the resistance. They shouted louder, waved their fake papers higher, but the crowd did not flinch. Instead, their unity grew stronger, and with it, the scammers' confidence faltered. A mother holding her child stepped forward, her eyes blazing with protectiveness. "Enough," she said firmly. "You will not trick her, and you will not trick anyone else here." Her words resonated deeply with the group, because in that moment, she spoke not just for herself, but for everyone gathered. The child in her arms symbolized what they were truly defending: the right to live without fear of exploitation. An older man, weathered by years of hard work, lifted his voice next. His tone was calm, but unyielding, carrying the weight of a lifetime spent enduring hardships. "We will stand here as long as we must," he declared. His presence, steady and immovable, sent a clear message that there would be no retreat. The crowd nodded in agreement, each face hardened with resolve. The elderly woman, who moments earlier felt so small, now stood taller. She looked around at the strangers who had become her shield, and her fear gave way to something she hadn't felt in years: trust. Tears welled in her eyes, not from despair, but from the overwhelming sight of compassion taking shape around her. For the first time, she realized that her community saw her, valued her, and would not abandon her. The scammers' bravado crumbled. Their words lost power, their gestures lost meaning, and their lies dissolved in the face of undeniable truth. They were outnumbered, not just in bodies but in spirit. And in that moment, the community had already won, not only saving one woman from deception, but proving that unity is the greatest weapon against those who prey on the vulnerable. As the crowd grew, the scammers' arrogance shrank into frustration. They muttered curses under their breath, trying to retreat with dignity, but every step backward revealed their weakness. The elderly woman watched them closely, her trembling hands now steadying against the support of a neighbor's arm. What had started as a terrifying encounter was transforming into a living testimony of courage, where kindness proved stronger than manipulation. A young man pulled out his phone, recording every second. The red light of the camera was like a torch, illuminating the truth and erasing the scammer's last weapon: secrecy. They knew that with every passing second, their faces and actions were being documented, their lies exposed not only to those present, but soon to the entire town. Panic flickered in their eyes as they realized their power had vanished. The crowd, however, remained calm. No one shouted insults or raised fists. They didn't need to. Their silence, their unity, and their sheer presence carried a louder message than any violence could. It was dignity versus deceit, and dignity was winning. The scammers stammered, their voices tripping over broken lies, while the community stood like a fortress built of ordinary people refusing to be silent. The elderly woman found her voice at last. With a trembling yet firm tone, she spoke the words that silenced the scammers completely. "You cannot fool me anymore." Those words, simple but powerful, struck deeper than any confrontation. She was no longer the victim they thought she would be. Surrounded by protectors, she had become a symbol of resilience. The scammers turned to leave, their exit marked not by triumph, but by shame. And as they slipped away, the community's eyes followed them, ensuring their deceit would find no refuge here again. It wasn't just a victory for one woman. It was a victory for everyone who dared to stand together. When the danger had passed, the community didn't disperse immediately. Instead, they stayed close, checking on the elderly woman, offering her water, comfort, and words of reassurance. She clutched her shopping bag tightly, tears flowing freely now, not from fear, but from relief. Every face around her radiated warmth, proving that humanity still held the power to restore what cruelty tried to steal. The young shopkeeper, who had first stepped forward, gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said softly. His words carried no grandeur, but they carried truth. She looked at him, then at the others, realizing that her life had been touched by something rare, the kind of courage that doesn't come from strength alone, but from compassion shared among many. Children who had watched the scene from a distance now came closer, their eyes wide with wonder. To them, this wasn't just an afternoon, it was a lesson. They saw adults choose unity over fear, truth over deception. They saw ordinary people turn into heroes, and those images would remain etched in their young hearts, shaping how they would face the world in years to come. The older man, still standing firm, turned to the group and said, "This is what community means. We protect each other." His words carried a wisdom that resonated deeply. Everyone nodded because they knew it was true. In that moment, they were no longer just neighbors. They were guardians, bound together by a shared promise to never let injustice stand unchallenged. As the elderly woman smiled through her tears, gratitude poured from her in ways words could never fully capture. She wasn't just thankful for their protection. She was thankful for the reminder that she mattered, that her life was worth defending. And for the community, that realization was the true victory of the day. In the days that followed, word of what had happened spread quickly through the town. People spoke of the elderly woman not as a victim, but as someone who had been defended with honor. The story carried from the market to the church, from cafes to workplaces, reminding everyone that unity is more powerful than any trick or deception. The community, once just a collection of individuals, now felt more like a family bound by shared courage. The young teenager who had stood by the shopkeeper replayed the moment in his mind over and over. At first, he had been afraid to get involved, but seeing the woman's fear had awakened something inside him. That night, he told his parents about what happened, and for the first time, he realized that bravery doesn't always mean fighting. It can simply mean standing where you're needed most. His parents looked at him with pride, knowing he had learned a lesson that would carry him for life. Meanwhile, the elderly woman began to feel a shift in her heart. She had spent years believing she was invisible, a forgotten shadow in a fast-moving world. But the stand taken on her behalf showed her that she was still seen, still valued. She no longer walked with her head down, but with her chin lifted slightly higher, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that came from knowing she mattered to those around her. The scammers, now exposed, found no place to hide. Videos of the confrontation circulated online, capturing their faces and their lies. They had thought they were clever, but instead, they had become a warning to others like them, that communities united by compassion will not tolerate cruelty. Their attempt at exploitation had been shattered, and in its place, a lesson of solidarity had taken root. But perhaps the most powerful change was the bond forged among the townspeople themselves. They had learned that they were not powerless, that together, they could face threats that seemed impossible alone. And with that knowledge, a quiet but unshakable confidence settled over them, ensuring that no one among them would ever again face darkness without light. Weeks later, the elderly woman sat on her porch, watching the same street where her life had almost been torn apart. Children laughed as they played, neighbors greeted one another warmly, and life seemed calmer, safer. She knew the memory of that day would never leave her, but instead of haunting her, it had become a source of strength. Each face she saw in her community was a reminder that goodness could still be found in abundance. The shopkeeper, the teenager, the mother with her child, the older man, they were no longer just names or faces passing by. They had become her protectors, her allies, her family by choice rather than blood. Whenever she passed them on the street, their smiles carried an unspoken bond, a promise that kindness would always stand taller than cruelty. For the community, the incident had sparked more than just pride. It sparked action. Neighbors began to check on one another more often, especially the elderly and the vulnerable. People no longer turned their eyes away from trouble. Instead, they leaned in, ready to defend and protect. The act of unity had planted seeds that grew into a culture of care, reshaping how they lived together. The elderly woman often reflected on the nightmarish moment when she thought her world was collapsing. But now, she saw it differently. What the scammers meant for harm had turned into a moment of awakening, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed or heard the story. She no longer felt like a victim. She felt like the keeper of a truth too powerful to ignore. Her story became a beacon that spread far beyond the town. Other communities heard about it and were inspired to act differently, to look out for one another, to recognize that every vulnerable person is a reflection of themselves. What began with one woman's cry and a community's response was now becoming a message carried far and wide, that together, people can build walls of compassion stronger than any scheme of deception. As seasons changed, the memory of that day never faded. The elderly woman often walked through the marketplace where it all began, and each time, she was greeted warmly by those who had stood with her. A nod from the shopkeeper, a wave from the teenager, a gentle smile from the mother. All of it reminded her that Unity had rewritten her story. What had once been a moment of terror had become a symbol of resilience, etched into the collective heart of the town. For the younger generation, the story grew into a lesson passed down like folklore. Children whispered about the day the entire town stood together, their eyes wide with admiration. Teachers used it as an example of bravery, and parents told it at bedtime as proof that goodness still lived in the world. The elderly woman, though humble, became a quiet hero, not because of what she did, but because of the courage others found through her. The scammers, unable to escape their infamy, faded into obscurity. But the strength of the community only grew brighter with time. Meetings were held to discuss ways of protecting the vulnerable, watch groups formed, and neighbors who once lived in silence now reached out to one another. That day had changed the rhythm of their lives forever. The woman herself often sat in prayerful reflection, grateful not only for her rescue, but for the deeper gift it gave her, the realization that she was not alone in the world. For years she had believed no one would notice her absence, no one would care if she was harmed. But that day shattered her isolation, proving that even in her quiet, unseen life, her worth was undeniable. And in the stillness of those evenings, she would smile, knowing that the strength of 50 hearts had not just saved her from scammers. It had given her the courage to believe in humanity again. Her life had been touched by compassion, and that compassion had lit a fire that would burn in her community for generations. Months later, the town organized a gathering in the central square to celebrate the spirit of unity that had been born that day. Families came with food, children played, and laughter filled the air. In the center sat the elderly woman, her eyes glistening as she watched the life around her blossom into something she once thought she would never see again. A community alive with trust and care. The young shopkeeper spoke first, humbly reminding everyone that he was just doing what anyone should have done. But the crowd cheered for him anyway, because they knew he had been the spark. The teenager followed, his voice stronger now, telling the story of how stepping forward that day had changed him forever. He admitted that before, he had thought bravery was for others, but now he knew it lived inside him too. The mother with her child lifted her little one into her arms, smiling as she said, "We protected her like we would protect our own family." Her words resonated deeply with everyone present, because that was the truth. On that day, they had all become family, tied together not by blood but by choice. The elderly woman wept quietly as she listened, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of their loyalty. When it was her turn to speak, the crowd fell silent. She did not give a long speech, nor did she try to hold their attention with grand gestures. Instead, she spoke from her heart. "You saved more than my life that day. You gave me back my dignity, my hope, and my faith in people." Her words, trembling yet strong, carried a weight that silenced the entire square. The applause that followed was not just for her, but for everyone who had chosen to stand together. That night, under the glow of lanterns and stars, the town realized that their greatest strength was not in the buildings they had built or the rules they followed. It was in the compassion that flowed from one heart to another, binding them forever as a community that chose light over darkness. As months passed, the elderly woman's story began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just a memory of one afternoon. It became a symbol whispered in every corner of the town. People spoke of how the community had risen like a single body, not with weapons or anger, but with presence, conviction, and compassion. It was a reminder that ordinary streets could be transformed into arenas of justice when people chose to act together. For the elderly woman, healing came slowly but steadily. She no longer walked with the same hesitation that once defined her. Instead, she moved with a quiet dignity, knowing that the eyes around her no longer saw her as fragile, but as someone who carried the mark of resilience. Every smile she received, every hand extended in greeting, reminded her that her worth was affirmed the day her community chose to stand. The shopkeeper often caught himself glancing toward her house, a subtle reassurance that she remained safe. He never considered himself a hero, but deep down, He knew he had played a part in sparking something far greater than himself. That knowledge gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before, proof that courage can ripple far beyond the moment it is first shown. The teenager, too, was transformed. He began helping neighbors more often, carrying groceries, mowing lawns, always remembering how one simple choice had changed everything that day. His friends teased him at first, but eventually, they began following his example. What started as one act of bravery was slowly reshaping the next generation into protectors rather than bystanders. The community, bound by that unforgettable event, grew stronger with every retelling of the story. And while the scammers had vanished, the memory of their attempt had left behind something more enduring than fear. A lesson carved into the hearts of everyone who stood together, that deception cannot thrive where compassion reigns. Years later, the elderly woman found herself sharing her story with children gathered at the community hall. Her voice carried wisdom, her words carrying not only the memory of fear, but the triumph of hope. The children listened in silence, their eyes wide, learning that strength is not always found in muscle or power, but in unity and love. She ended her tale by saying, "That day, I was saved not by one, but by many, and that is why I am still here to tell you this." The town itself had been shaped permanently by that moment. Neighbors continued to look out for each other, forming bonds that could not be broken. What once was a place of quiet anonymity had become a sanctuary of mutual care. They were no longer just individuals coexisting. They were guardians of one another, carrying forward the spirit of protection that had defined them years ago. The shopkeeper, older now, still remembered the instant when he chose to step outside. He realized that his one decision had sparked a chain reaction, a fire of courage that spread until 50 voices stood together. He carried that truth with pride, not as his own accomplishment, but as proof that even the smallest act can awaken something unstoppable in others. The teenager, now a man, often told his own children about the day he learned what true bravery meant. He explained that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand when standing is hardest. His children listened with awe, knowing they were inheriting more than a story. They were inheriting a legacy of compassion. And so, the story of an elderly woman and a united community endured across generations. It lived on not as a tale of danger, but as a testament to the unshakable truth that when people choose to rise together, no deception, no cruelty, and no darkness can prevail. It was a reminder that the greatest power lies not in standing alone, but in standing side by side. In the end, the story of the elderly woman and her community is not just about stopping a scam. It is about the strength that rises when people choose to stand together. What began as a single act of courage from one shopkeeper grew into a wave of compassion that transformed fear into hope. It reminds us that even in a world where deception often hides in plain sight, unity can strip away every mask and reveal the truth. This moment showed that real power does not come from those who exploit the vulnerable, but from those who defend them. The scammers believed they held control, yet their lies collapsed under the weight of solidarity. The lesson is clear. When compassion becomes collective, even the most fragile life is shielded by an unbreakable force. That force is the heart of community, the invisible bond that binds us all. The elderly woman's story leaves us with a timeless truth. Dignity is not restored by wealth or authority, but by love and human connection. She walked away not just protected, but transformed, carrying within her the knowledge that she was seen, valued, and cherished. And in her story, we find a mirror reflecting what we, too, are capable of when we refuse to look away from injustice. So as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what role would you have played? Would you have stepped forward, even when fear whispered to stay back? The answer to that question is not only about this story, it is about the kind of world we choose to build together, one moment, one decision, one act of courage at a time. If this story touched you, let it continue beyond this moment. Share your thoughts in the comments. Add your voice to this community of reflection, and subscribe so that together we can keep exploring stories that remind us of who we are meant to be. And if you believe in the power of unity, let your gesture be simple but powerful. Leave a like so this message of compassion can reach even more hearts.